Welcome to Sleep Vibes Now. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin our journey into the vast, silent reaches of the cosmos, take a moment to adjust your pillows, pull up the blankets, and let the weight of the day start to fade. Tonight, we're embarking on a retelling of Interstellar, a story of love, time, and the quiet mysteries of the stars. We'll follow the path from the dusty plains of Earth to the shimmering horizons of distant worlds, exploring the deep bonds that connect us across the light years. So take a deep breath, clear your mind, and let's begin. The world had grown quiet, but it was a restless kind of silence. In the heart of the Great Plains, the wind was a constant companion, a low and steady hum that moved through the endless rows of corn like a long, slow exhale. The earth was tired, its soil turning to a fine silver dust that coated everything in a thin layer of history. Inside the farmhouse, the air was still and warm, smelling of dry wood and the faint, sweet scent of the harvest. Cooper sat on the porch, watching the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip, turning the sky into a bruised purple and deep orange. He could hear the rhythmic creak of the porch swing and the distant metallic clatter of the combines working the fields. It was a life measured in seasons and soil, but his eyes were always drawn upward, toward the first few stars blinking into existence. He remembered a time when they looked up and wondered at their place in the stars, rather than looking down and worrying about their place in the dust. The house itself seemed to breathe with the family inside, a sanctuary of wood and glass against the encroaching brown of the world outside. Every surface held a fine veil of silt, a reminder that the world was changing, fading into a hazy memory of what it once was. In the upstairs bedroom, the world felt even more distant. Murph's room was a place of books and quiet observations, where the sunlight fell in long, slanted bars across the wooden floorboards. There was a mystery living in the bookshelves, a ghost that moved with a heavy, invisible hand. Cooper stood in the doorway, watching as his daughter tracked the patterns of fallen books and the strange arrangements of dust on the floor. It wasn't a frightening presence. It was a rhythmic, mathematical one. The dust didn't just fall. It gathered in thick, vertical lines, pulled by a force that defied the simple logic of the farm. They spent hours in the hushed stillness of that room, decoding the language of the gravity, feeling the pulse of something far away reaching through the fabric of the house. The ticking of the clock on the shelf was the only other sound, a steady metronome marking the time they had left. When the patterns finally revealed a set of coordinates, it felt like the house itself was pointing a finger toward the mountains, toward a secret hidden in the folds of the earth. The drive that followed was a long, dark journey through the wind-whipped corn, the headlights of the truck cutting through the haze like twin beacons, leading them away from the familiar and toward a destiny that had been waiting for them in the dark. The facility was a fortress of concrete and cold light, tucked away behind a massive, unassuming gate in the mountains. Inside, The air was crisp and smelled of ozone and heavy machinery. It was a world of hushed voices and the blue glow of monitors, a place where the last scientists and engineers worked in the shadows to save a world that had forgotten them. Cooper walked through the vast, echoing hangars, his footsteps hollow against the polished floors. At the center of this underground hive was Professor Brand, an older man with a voice like dry parchment, and eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating the weight of the heavens. He stood before a chalkboard, covered in a dense, sprawling forest of equations, the work of a lifetime dedicated to a single, impossible problem. Beside him was his daughter, Amelia Brand. She carried herself with a quiet, sharp intensity, her eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the laboratory. She was a scientist of deep conviction, her life's work tied to the stars her father had spent decades charting. Professor Brand spoke of the dying Earth and the one last hope they had, explaining the Lazarus missions that had paved the way. He spoke of the wormhole near Saturn, a golden sphere of warped space that acted as a bridge to another galaxy. The room was filled with the silent pressure of a countdown that had already begun. They weren't just looking for a planet, they were looking for a future. The plan was a masterpiece of physics and desperation, requiring a crew that could navigate the unknown. Cooper looked at the father and daughter, seeing the heavy blanket of responsibility they shared, a bond forged in the cold logic of survival and the warm, desperate hope for a new home. It was a symphony of preparation and heavy hearts. The wind had died down, leaving the farm in a rare, perfect stillness. Cooper drove away through the corn, the stalks brushing against the sides of the truck with a sound like 1,000 whispers. At the launch site, he met the team that would become his world for the years to come. There was Doyle, a man of steady nerves and calculated risks, and Romilly, a physicist whose quiet exterior masked a mind that could visualize the bending of space-time. But most striking of all were the mechanical members of the crew, Tars and Case. Tars was a rectangular monolith of brushed metal, a machine that moved with a surprising, multi-jointed grace. His voice was a rhythmic, artificial baritone, programmed with a dry sense of humor and a loyalty that was absolute. He stood like a silent sentinel as the crew suited up, his sensors scanning the environment with a calm, mechanical precision. The countdown was a steady, mechanical chant that filled the air, a rhythmic vibration that grew until it shook the very foundation of the earth. As the engines ignited, a wall of white fire pushed back the shadows, and, for a moment, the farm and the dust were forgotten. The acceleration was a crushing embrace, a force that pinned Cooper, Amelia, Doyle, and Romilly to their seats as the blue sky deepened into navy, then indigo, and finally a perfect, absolute black. The roar of the engines faded into a muffled thrum, and then, with a sudden, jarring grace, there was nothing but the silence of the vacuum. Space was not empty. It was a vast, velvet ocean of potential. The Endurance was a ring of white light, rotating slowly against the backdrop of a billion stars to create a gentle, artificial gravity. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was controlled and quiet, the only sounds being the rhythmic whir of the life support and the soft, musical pings of the navigation computers. Cooper, Amelia, Doyle, and Romilly moved through the modules with the slow, floating grace of deep-sea divers. They began the long trek towards Saturn, a journey that would take 2 years of their lives. Tars was always there, his metallic footsteps a rhythmic clack-clack against the deck plates as he performed his duties. He and Case were the heartbeat of the ship, managing the complex systems that kept them alive in the void. In the dim light of the galley, the crew shared meals and stories of the world they had left behind. Amelia spoke of her father's work and the hope that the Lazarus missions had found something viable on the other side. Romilly spent hours staring into the darkness, contemplating the sheer scale of the space they were crossing, while Doyle checked and rechecked the landing craft. They listened to recordings of rain and birdsong from Earth, artificial sounds that felt like a tether to a home that grew more distant with every second. They were sailors on a silent sea, moving toward the amber giant of Saturn, carrying the hopes of a world in a vessel of steel and light. The journey was a long, slow climb into the deep, a period of reflection and preparation for the wonders and the terrors that waited for them on the other side of the wormhole. The 2-year journey across the solar system concluded in the shadow of Saturn, a giant of amber and pale gold that filled the viewports of the Endurance with its silent, majestic scale. But the target was not the planet itself, but the shimmering anomaly that hung nearby, a perfect, crystal-clear sphere of warped space known as the Wormhole. As the ship approached, the stars behind the sphere began to bend and ripple, creating a kaleidoscopic reflection of a distant, unknown galaxy. Cooper steered the ship toward the center of the distortion, the silence of the cabin deepening until the only sound was the steady, rhythmic breathing of the crew. Inside the wormhole, time and space seemed to fold like liquid. The walls of the Endurance vibrated with a low-frequency hum, a resonance that felt less like a sound and more like a physical presence. As they moved through the bridge between worlds, Amelia reached out toward the shimmering ripples in the air, her fingers appearing to touch a distortion that felt like a handshake from another dimension, a fleeting, silent connection with the beings who had placed the gateway there. The transition was a slow, luminous dream, a journey through a corridor of light that eventually deposited them into a new sky, dominated by the swirling golden radiance of the supermassive black hole Gargantua. They were no longer in the neighborhood of Earth. They were in a place where the rules of the universe were written in fire and gravity. The first world they visited was a place of profound, terrifying beauty. Miller's planet was a world of water, orbiting so close to the massive gravity of Gargantua that time itself began to stretch and slow, turning every hour on the surface into 7 years back on Earth. The descent in the Ranger was a journey through a thick, misty atmosphere that eventually cleared to reveal a horizon of infinite gray. There was no land here, only a shallow, waist-deep ocean that stretched in every direction under a heavy, overcast sky. The sound of the water was a constant, rhythmic lap, lap against the hull of the ship, a peaceful sound that masked the immense forces at work. Cooper, Amelia, and Doyle stepped out into the water, their boots splashing softly as they moved toward the wreckage of the previous mission. The air was cool and tasted of salt, and the silence was only broken by the distant, low-frequency groan of the tides. In the distance, what they first thought were mountains were actually massive, slow-moving walls of water, tidal waves miles high, pulled upward by the gravity of the black hole. They watched as the first wave approached, a majestic and terrifying mountain of ocean that moved with a slow, inevitable grace. There was a sense of immense scale here, a feeling of being a tiny speck in a universe that did not care for the passage of human time. They worked quickly, the urgency of the mission tempered by the rhythmic pulse of the waves, knowing that every second spent in this beautiful, watery world was a lifetime lost to the families they had left behind in the dust. The return to the Endurance was a somber, silent ascent. As the Ranger docked with the ringed mothership, the crew felt the weight of the gravity they had escaped. But it was the weight of time that pressed hardest against their chests. Stepping through the airlock, they were met by Romilly. He was no longer the man they had left only hours ago. His hair was streaked with gray, and his eyes held the weary, profound depth of someone who had spent 2 decades in the absolute solitude of the void. He had waited 23 years, 4 months, and 8 days in the rhythmic hum of the ship, watching the stars remain frozen while his friends were lost in the dilation of the water world. The atmosphere in the galley was thick with a heavy archival silence as Cooper sat before the monitor to catch up on the messages from home. The screen flickered with the ghosts of his children's lives, years of birthdays, graduations, and eventually the face of a grown Murph. Her voice was a soft, steady pulse of resentment and love, a reminder that the world he left behind had continued to turn without him. The farmhouse, the dust, and the ticking clock in her room were now relics of a distant past. Cooper sat in the dim blue light of the cabin, the only sound being the soft whir of the life support and the muffled, mechanical clicking of tars in the corner. They were survivors of a temporal storm, drifting in a sea of stars that felt colder and more vast than ever before. The mission had a new, desperate urgency now. They weren't just fighting for a future, they were fighting against a past that was rapidly disappearing into the dark. After a period of quiet mourning and difficult calculations, the Endurance set its sights on the second candidate, a world of ice and ammonia orbiting the far side of Gargantua. The descent to man's planet was a journey into a landscape of jagged, crystalline beauty. As the ship pierced the clouds, the crew didn't see a sky, but a ceiling of frozen vapor, massive, suspended mountains of ice that hung in the air like a shattered mirror. The world below was a monochrome desert of white and deep indigo, where the wind carried a biting, chemical chill that seemed to penetrate the very hull of the Ranger. They touched down on a glacier that stretched to the horizon, the landing struts creaking as they settled into the ancient ice. The sound here was different from the rhythmic lap of Miller's Ocean. It was a world of sharp cracks, low-frequency groans, and the constant, high-pitched whistle of the ammonia wind. They moved toward the survival pod of Dr. Mann, the leader of the Lazarus missions, and the man who represented the absolute best of humanity's courage. The interior of his pod was a cramped, sterile sanctuary of white plastic and blinking lights, smelling of recycled air and old insulation. When they finally woke him from his long, icy sleep, the silence of the planet was broken by the sound of a man weeping, a raw, human sound that echoed against the frozen walls. This was a world of cold endurance and solitary survival, where the sky was made of ice, and the only hope was a signal sent across the light years by a man who had forgotten the sound of another human voice.